Hello. Welcome to Make It to the Dog Ears. I'm going to do 25 minutes of Renaissance philosophy. I'm going to study this time. Let me get my paper. It's just been maybe a week or two since I've studied well. Let's just dive in. I'm going to take notes on some stuff that I like. Translation, terminology, and style in philosophical discourse. The scope of philosophical translation. Jean Roboto, Raza's translation of Posterior Analytics in 1406, and Niccolo Leonico Tomio's rendering of the Parva Naturalia. Write that one. Parva Naturalia in 1522 to 5. 18 Italian Byzantine scholars produced only 15 different Latin versions of half as many of Aristotle's works, including spurious works and counting the Parva Naturalia as one work. In the 16th century, more than 50 scholars from various parts of Europe produced nearly 200 Latin translations of over 40 texts ascribed to Aristotle. 200 Latin translations of over 40 texts ascribed to Aristotle. So 200 Latin. Okay. The most productive of the 15th century translators were the Byzantines George of Trebizond and Johannes Agrippolus, who each completed 10 texts. In the 16th century, the Frenchman Joachim Perrion challenged even the prolific William of Moerbeke by turning more than 20 works into Ciceronian Latin. These two scholars took very different approaches to philosophical translation. George of Trebizond stayed as close to the verbal structure of the text as comprehensible Latin would permit, while Agrippolus translated so loosely was often condemned as a paraphraser. So, loose translations. George believed that transliteration was sometimes justified by an untranslatable word or phrase in Greek, but Perrion wanted to find a Ciceronian equivalent for everything the Stagirite had said, unlike Agrippolus, who was content with some of the unclassical Latin the medieval translators had introduced. Variations in translation serve varieties of audience, and the audience changed with time, as was educated by new accomplishments in translation. Before the 1520s, most works of Aristotle that were printed were medieval Latin translations. Only after that time did readers of Aristotle see more humanist Latin in print or much Greek at all. The Nicomachean Ethics, which Leonardo Bruni translated early in the 1400s, continued to attract humanist translators through the 16th century. No one published its Greek text outside the collected editions until 1523. 1523 new translations. After this day, at least 25 editions containing the Greek appeared. By the end of the century, many of them motivated by the philological interests of the humanists. During the same period, the Greek De Anima, which was less interesting to humanists, was separately edited only 4 times. None of these editions was philological. Yet Latin translation of De Anima appeared frequently because it was a crucial philosophical text. De Anima. Evidently, the readership for translations of Aristotle was not unitary. Its division into humanist and philosophical segments, though these were not well defined or always separated, is also borne out by the lapse of a century between the Aldine Opera Omnia, 1495-8 of the Greek Aristotle, Isaac Casaubon's Greek Latin edition, 1590 of the complete works. The whole corpus, as was known before the 19th century, had appeared in humanist Latin by the early 16th century. Benedictus Fontana attempted humanist collected works as early as 1496. He had to fill many gaps with medieval translations. The Basel Opera Omnia translation prepared by Simon Granius in 1538, however, was solidly humanist. If anybody knows anything on humanism, what that really means, let me know. New translating and the polemic stimulated by a continuous century and bilingual editions multiplied after 1550, but the late date of the Casaubon edition suggests there was no single large group of scholars pressing to read all of Aristotle in a translation that also referred systematically to the original. Differences of audience were reflected in the commentary literature as well. The publication of choice for philosophers was at first a Latin translation explicated by a Latin commentary. Later in the 16th century, a Greek original might join the two Latin texts. The selection of commentaries also widened. In the late 15th century, Ermolao Barbero began the process of translating those Hellenistic commentaries on Aristotle that were unknown to the Middle Ages. Jewish scholars, encouraged by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and others, revised familiar commentaries of Averroes and presented new ones in Latin versions based on Hebrew intermediaries. Some humanists like Brunei saw Aristotle not simply as a philosopher, but also as one of the summi auctores, the admired giants of antiquity. Interested in much in eloquence and philosophy, they produced their own independent commentaries in the form of philological advertationes that concentrate on grammar, literature, and history. So is grammar, literature, and history important? Yeah. What do you guys think? The philological erudition felt interest in many philosophers has continued, like Petro, Pump, and Nazi, to write commentaries in the older philosophical style, and also consult medieval commentaries, especially those of Thomas Aquinas, not to depend on medieval translations. Because of versions of Brunei and his colleagues threatened a breach of terminological continuity with scholastic philosophy, Alonso de Cartagena and other critics of humanist translation recommended using the Vulgate versions, partially in order to sustain a commentary tradition whose unawareness of the Greek text or indifference to them appalled the humanists. Some were content, however, to read Thomas as if he had read Brunei. Even though Thomas explained the old version, wrote Ludovicus de Valentia, seems to interpret the new, and Ludovicus arranged an alliance between Saint and Chancellor by expunging offensive transliterations from Thomas' commentary. Lefebvre de Etaples devised another very popular solution by printing the Agorippus paraphrase of the Nicomachean Ethics, along with Brunei's translation and the rival medieval version defended by Alonso. The strongest marriage between the accomplishments of humanist translation and the needs of the philosophical community came in 1562, with the second of the great Gianta editions of Aristotle Averroes, originally published in 1550-1552.
So he uses that pathos or pathetic device to have this, end it with something like, that's how
Aristotle was fundamental to the university curriculum, but Plato was not. Only 4 of his dialogues have been translated, partially or completely, in antiquity or the Middle Ages. Not surprisingly, early modern translation of Plato was smaller in scope than the Latinizing of Aristotle. It involved fewer scholars, depended far more on the work of one great translator, Marsilio Ficino, who published his Latin Opera Omnia in 1484. Not counting Ficino, there were 13 15th century translators. Attracted by Plato's eloquence, his compatibility with Christianity, his justification of tyrannical politics, who produced 24 different versions of 18 genuine and spurious dialogues and letters. In the whole period between Manuel Chrysoloras' initial attempt at the Republic around 1400 and the 1602 reissue of the revised Ficino opera, more than 40 scholars turned more than 40 Platonic texts into Latin, nearly 90 different versions. However, about half of these were translated only the Opera Omnia of Ficino or by his 2 lone competitors, Janus Cornelius and Jean de Serre, whose collection saw only a single printing each. Next to Ficino, the most active of the 15th century translators was Brunei, who rendered 7 works early in the century. A notable habit of these early Renaissance Platonists was a readiness to bowdlerize their translations and adapt the meaning of the Greek to various ideological ends. Even Ficino, a fastidiously faithful translator, once or twice tried to improve on Plato. 16th century translators concentrated largely on spurious works. The Axiarchus was remarkably popular, one revising older translations to match them with commentaries and making literal translations for pedagogical use. Plato and Aristotle dominated philosophical translation as they dominated philosophy, but Renaissance scholars also made other important thinkers more familiar to the West. Ficino's versions of Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, Porphyry, Cineas, Homer's Trismegistus, Pseudo-Dionysius, and lesser figures are well known. It's likely that Ambrosio Traversari also translated parts of the Platonic theology of Proclus. The most important contribution to philosophy being 1424-1433 by Latinizing Diogenes Laertius, whose lives became the basis of early modern knowledge of the pre-Socratic and Hellenistic schools, especially Epicureanism. In 1479, Angelo Poliziano translated the Problems, then ascribed to Alexander of Aphrodisias and then Enchiridion of Epictetus, apparently thought realizing that Niccolò Parodi had already translated the latter in 1450. The Enchiridion was important as one of the few non-fragmentary Greek sources on Stoicism. Another was the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which despite the famous author remained little more than an empty title until William Xylander brought out his De Sipso Se Vita Sua 1559 along with the Greek Editio Princeps. For the skeptics, Traversari's Diogenes was also indispensable, especially since useful translations of Sextus Empiricus came only in 1562. Henry Estienne's Outlines of Pioneerism 1569 didn't have his versus Mathematicals. Another significant doxographic collection was the Pasita of Aetius, attributed to Plutarch when Guillaume Boudet translated in 1503-05. So, a lot of Renaissance philosophers, I'm interested in what they did for medicine, law, theology. Why I read it is my faith in a higher power. I want to improve my vocabulary. I think I just want to make a big chunk out of my reading tonight. We'll just go with that. Guarino da Verona, Poggio Bracciolini, Lucio de Arezzo, Giovanni Arispa, and other 15th century translators contributed Latin versions of Lucian's dialogues. This prepared the way for Nicola de Lanigo's vulgar treatments, Leon Battista Alberti's Lucianic imitations in the Intersociales and related works. These earlier humanists read the newly accessible Latin Lucian as if its parodies were serious descriptions of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy. Lucian's motivations were literary, not historical, when he depicted Socrates as, in Christopher Robinson's words, a bald, snub-nosed, hypocritical, pederastic lecher who swore by dogs and plane trees, held a dotty theory of ideas. He gave scant attention to Socratic doctrine, depending instead on the surefire comic contrast between the pretensions of the philosopher and the peccadillos of the charlatan. In their passion for the antique, and perhaps because of the compulsive moralizing of the Hellenistic schools, even when caricatured, rang true to their kindred sensibilities, humanists sometimes mistook Lucian's comedy for a history of ideas. Introducing his translation of Philosopher's Rousseau, Michel de Lorenzo recognized that Lucian wrote playfully. Luca de Antonio Bernardi de San Gimignano treated the same work as a textbook survey of the schools. On it, he based the school play De Inventione et Epitome Philosophorum for his grammar students, at least one of whom, Marsilio Ficino, was eventually to acquire a more refined understanding of the philosophies of late antiquity. In the next century, Erasmus and Thomas More could read, translate, and imitate Lucian with greater sensitivity to his fundamentally comic impulse. Yet for his own campaign against philosophical theology, Erasmus picked blunt weapons from Lucian's anti-philosophical armory. Especially hostile to philosophers were Erasmus and Lucian's Pythagoreans and Platonists because of their magical tricks, Stoics on account of their arrogance. Quite right, too. Erasmus, whose pedagogic authority was paramount, recommended Lucian as an ideal author for beginners in Greek, and after 1506 he gave Greekless readers a extraordinarily popular selection of translations of Lucian. Despite the thin, sporadic, and repetitive philosophical content of the dialogues, it's hard to underestimate the influence of the Latin Lucian, printed a complete edition around 338, and reputation of philosophy in the early modern period. Petrarch and Boccaccio tried to learn Lucian's language from the Italian Greek Sparlam and Lorenzo Pilato, while Coluccio Salutati and his friends revised medieval translations of Greek authors without knowing the language at all. Besides Tati also helped bring to Florence the Byzantine scholar who effectively inaugurated the age of humanist translation, Markel Chrysoloras. Chrysoloras, who arrived in 1397, dealt with subordinating translation to his more fundamental obligations as a teacher. Nonetheless, he soon prepared a rough, literal version of the Republic, further contradicted in practice his famous theoretical declaration against ad verbum translation.
climate destruction and so on. So it's really amazing to see all of these different qualities in one person. I highly recommend going and enjoying the very beginning, the start of Bowman's career with You Bright and Risen Angels. Thank you.
It was revised by Alberto Decembrio and revised again after 4 decades by Alberto's son
Thank you for watching News by
Pierre Candido in 1440. Meanwhile, another Byzantine scholar, George of Trebizond, became Greek to Venice in 1416. Historic translations of Aristotle and Plato were rigorous and literal. Letter quality won him the scorn of Theodore Gaza and others. Cardinal Bessarion, originally attracted like other Greek emigres to the Council of Ferrara in Florence in 1438-9, attributed a version of Aristotle's metaphysics and closely followed the Vulgate. His popular was Lefebvre de Etaples, who chose to establish his first edition in 1515. Of all the Byzantines, however, the most influential translator was Agorippolis, whose freer renderings of Aristotle ruled the arena of new translation in the 15th century and remained well known in the next. Most productive student of the Byzantines was Leonardo Bruni. His first round of Plato translations, between 1400 and 1415, grew out of literary and religious motives, which later dampened by his dislike of Socratic skepticism and of Plato's teachings on community of women and goods. Turning to Aristotle, he next decided in 1416 to devise Robert Grosseteste's widely used version of the Nicomachean Ethics. He was not aware of Grosseteste's authorship, but his intentions toward the medieval version were consciously hostile, as the introduction makes clear. The tone of these prefatory remarks, much as the unaccustomed style of his translation, provoked reactions from Ugo Benzi, Alonso de Cartagena, and others which involved him in a long exchange of polemics. One of his apologies was the first substantial theoretical statement on translation since St. Jerome's letter to Pammachius. He lit the way for many other controversialists and theoreticians over the next 2 centuries. Most important were Parion, speaking for Ciceronian translation, Edion Dole, setting guidelines for vernacular translators. In 1419-20, Bruni set out to replace another piece of the medieval Aristotle, the Essentio Durandae of the Economics. Judging by the number of manuscripts, this is a very successful work. Most fortunate effort was his last and philosophical translation, The Politics, 1438. My reason for translating, he wrote, was the same that led me to the Ethics, the very fine style of the Greek, reduced by the sins of a bad translator to laughable stupidity. Bruni compared his fate in his battles over translation to that of St. Stephen stoned by the Judaizers, but in more than 20 years not much had changed. Recovering from his martyrdom, he had even returned to Plato, 1423-7 and 1437. The influence of Bruni's Platonic translations was enormous until Ficino published his in 1484. Italians and Byzantines nearly monopolized philosophical translation in the 1400s and also left their mark on progress made in the next century when the French established a healthy tradition in Latin and the vernacular. The first text translated by Greek by a Frenchman were the works of Plutarch, Latinized in 1503 by Bude, also rendered the pseudo-Aristotelian De Mundo in 1526, served other translators invaluably with his philological work. Few had begun to edit translations of other scholars earlier with the popular Tres Conversiones of the Nicomachean Ethics. His editing generally included the sort of revising he described in his Metaphysics 1515. He compared Bessarion's translation with the Greek and have called it back to the senses wherever it strayed. To his version, I've added the Agorippolis, which smacks more of a paraphrase, but Bessarion better plays the part of a translator. He revised medieval versions of the topics and Sophistica more thoroughly, and encouraged the students to translate as well. Francois Vaudeblay, for example, published the first Renaissance Latin version of the Parva Naturalia in 1518, along with De Generatione in the meteorology. Other important French scholars who fought in the tradition of Bude Lefebvre were Gerard Roussel, Adrien Turnebus, Denis Lambert, Jacques Charpentier, Henri Estienne, Gentian Hervé, Isaac Casaubon. The grand champion was Perrion. His many translations of Aristotle succeed in the sense that they were frequently reprinted, but also provoked severe criticism. Even after Nicolas Grauchy revised them, they are not deemed fit to appear in Casaubon's bilingual opera of 1590. They are of little use in university teaching. Perrion's loyal readers must have had enough humanist education to parse his Ciceronian periods, but enough philosophical sophistication to worry over his abandonment of standard terminology. Likewise, Latin was still the universal, very nearly sole language of learned communication. There was a special and growing audience for vernacular translation philosophy and for original philosophizing in the vulgar tongues. Judging the depth of this activity, once recall that while Montaigne, who used vernacular translations, said he knew no Greek, he surely understood enough natural theology to write the Apology of Raymond Sebald. Exceptional erudition and Machiavelli's troubling originality occupied one extreme of a spectrum of vernacular philosophical discourse, whose other end one finds the more predictable and superficial motives of the courtiers and princes who often patronized translators. Under Francis I, enrichment of the French language became national policy. Francis became as energetic a patron of vernacular translations of Cicero, Plutarch, and Plato as Pope Nicholas V had been of Latin. Moreover, he had the advantage of precedent in the similar patronage of his predecessor Charles V, an history of French translation philosophy, reaching back to Jean de Meun's Boethius 1300, Nicolas Erasmus Aristotle 1377. French translators became quite active after 1530. Some fast talents in the country, including Etienne Dolet, Francis Hotman, Philip Laplace, were enlisted in the cause. Most important were Jacques Amiac for his Plutarch 1559, Louis Leroy for his Plato 1551. Even in Aristotle translations were less popular in vernacular. France outstripped England and Spain, but fell far short of what such figures as Antonio Bruciola accomplished in Italy. One theoretical problem was that more pressing for vernacular than for Latin translators was that of propriety and security. It was a good idea, for example, to make the political or religious ideas of the public available to a lay audience. Some vulgarizers feared being blamed for profaning philosophy secrets and for doing so in an indecorous tongue. John Floyer had a good answer, which was not entirely in keeping with the spirit of his age. Learning cannot be too common, and the commoner the better. Why but the vulgar should not know all? Francis Sauvage expressed a more typical attitude in the prologue to the first French vernacular rendering of any Plutarch's Moralia to appear in print. This effort is not thought so worthy of those who understand Greek or Latin to lower some to look at his work, which I have endeavored to translate for the instruction of the common people. Thus, if among my readers anyone's ears is more delicate, then please be tolerant of the ignorance and crudity of my style, waiting upon some other effort more carefully wrought than this. The ground for the vernacularization of Plutarch's philosophically rich and eclectic treatises had been cultivated since the early 15th century. The Italian humanists, Guarino, Francisco Filafo, Antonio Cicerino, and many others just began to Latinize them, thus creating demand for the Greek editio Princeps issued by Aldus in 1500, and the complete Latin translation by William Zelander in 1570. The greatest spur to the diffusion of the Latin Moralia in the 16th century was widely read selection first published by Erasmus in 1514. Then followed not only Froben's revision of the Greek text in 1542, Henry Estienne's in 1572, but also many collections of selected Latin treatises by a number of translators, 6 of them from Italy, France, Spain, Germany, England, Holland, and Hungary, who rendered 65 of Plutarch's essays by the time Zelander had finished his complete Latin Moralia. Vernacular alternatives to the Latin had entered the market before 1500. Even after the Greek texts had been printed, almost all were based on earlier Latin or vernacular versions, the notable exceptions being Willibald Peckheimer's German, Thomas Elliott's English, and Diego Grecian's Spanish. It was the French more than any others to whom the broader Latinist readership of the 16th century owed its philosophical, as well as historical Plutarch. 1571, 20 translators, including Estienne Pasquier, Geoffrey Torrey, and Estienne de la Botte, completed 23 French Moralia, but only 5 of these consulted original. Scopus sent to the Greeks, specifically that of Aldus and of Froben, was the hallmark of Amiot's complete Oma 1572. They also used Zelander, the Latin and French versions, especially those of Louis Leroy. Amiot aimed for clear, faithful, and stylistically varied language. but his notion of fidelity permitted him compressions, expansions, and variations in the interest of lucidity and symmetry. So as to avoid a Latinized and neologized French, let some said oddly contemporary Christian representation of Greek ideas in other times to care for periphrasis. The success of Emerat's efforts was such that this century saw only two other French translations of the Moralia. Montaigne made use of Emerat's masterpiece, from the Greek also in the late Philemon Holland's English Morals of 1603. That was the end of that passage. Thank you for watching. Make it to the dog ears. See you later.
Corner of the plastic